On August 20th, 2014, Christian and circle tracer Josh Feuerstein submitted a challenge and offered a reward
to anybody that could provide me proof or evidence that God does not exist. I think it's rather ridiculous that there's been people for a long time that have said that God does not exist, and yet they're unarmed because they have zero evidence and zero proof. How would that ever hold up in a court of law?
Unfortunately, or rather thankfully for his bank account, this is an unfalsifiable hypothesis. Logically speaking, one does not assume that something exists until we can prove that it doesn't. It's the other way around. And it's important to note that the word assume is an important part of all this. Do we know for certain that there is no God? No. Is it reasonable to conclude or assume that there isn't one so long as there is not enough evidence? Yes. The burden of proof is on the one making the claim, no one else. Thus, the challenge itself is logically backwards. While presenting this challenge, Mr. Feuerstein made the following scattershot argument.
Now, the problem with truth and absolute truth is I believe that this generation doesn't like that concept because it means that there's moral law. It means that now that there's something that they will one day have to answer to. In fact, if you were to ask an atheist, I don't think he would ever actually be able to condemn something like the Holocaust and the killing of millions and millions of innocent people. Why? Because he just believes that they're an accident. They're just merely some molecular structure, that they're just part of this scientific thing called evolution, survival of the fittest. Well, how then was Hitler just not the fittest?
Albeit that was a little here and there. The thesis of his observations is that atheists have no morals, which is one way of saying that an atheist has no basis for morality. If this is correct, it would mean that religion, particularly monotheism, is necessary for establishing a moral basis. So with that, let's examine a brief history of religion. Christianity was founded in the 1st century CE. However, this was not the beginning of monotheism. The first monotheistic religion, Judaism, was founded in about 1800 BCE, but we can go back further than this to the Indus Valley, perhaps as long ago as 2300 BCE when Hinduism was founded, the oldest religion still practiced to this day. If we wanted to go back even further than this, we could travel back to Egypt in 4000 BCE, where the first religious records, the earliest Egyptian myths, can be found. Now, naturally, it's difficult to be absolutely certain about a timeline such as this, and there's plenty of debate surrounding it. For example, some would argue that Zoroastrianism is really the first monotheistic religion. But if we accept this timeline as a rough idea of the history of religion, we can see that it has been around for at least 6,000 years, providing a moral compass for mankind to follow. Usually. And according to this argument, that would mean that there was no moral code before this, but moral principles likely developed in parallel with language, art, and technology, so its roots should actually come from primitive hunter-gatherer tribes over 50,000 years ago. 46 millennia before the earliest known religious records. If a moral understanding existed long before monotheism, there's no reason to suspect that a moral understanding is not obtainable without monotheism. Now again, this historical counterargument is subject to debate. There is a case to be made that these hunter-gatherers had their own religious practices. So let's make a scientific counterargument as well, starting with the following questions. Does morality have to be learned? Is it possible to have a moral code that's innate? The answer is yes. Well, the answer to the first one is no. The answer to the second one is yes. If you have empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And though empathy can be improved with the right nurture, it is ultimately a product of nature. The science that supports empathy is found with mirror neurons in the brain. These are the neurons that fire when you relate to other people's experiences. Have you ever seen someone wipe out on a skateboard? You cringe, don't you? Those are your mirror neurons firing because you've just imagined yourself in their position. This is why we cry while watching movies about fictional people and feel a sense of accomplishment when sports teams that we don't play on win the game. Just the same, empathy is something that we feel naturally, instinctually, well, at least most of us do, when we see another person in distress. Now, at this point, Mr. Feuerstein might claim that God gave us these mirror neurons.
I guarantee that if there were no laws and no government, that you would feel wrong inside of you killing somebody. Why? because God's written it on your heart.
But remember, the burden would be on him to prove that, not anyone else to disprove it. And if it can't be proven, we may assume that that is not the case. If you ever meet someone who makes this argument, you might consider asking them this question: if you weren't religious, would you find it wrong to murder? If the answer is yes, that would contradict their argument. And if the answer is no, thank God they are religious.
Maybe for a long time you've kind of put him out of your mind, because to think that there might be a Jesus might mean that there's a heaven or there's a hell, or that there might be some Bible or some law or some book or some set of rules that you might have to live up to. But I challenge you today, if your eternity depends on it, to look into it, to have an honest conversation with God and ask him genuinely in your heart that if he exists, that he would show himself to you.
Having fun?